On March 12, 2026, an electrical pole in western Nebraska snapped under wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour. The sparks caught dry grass. And within 6 hours, the fire that started from that single broken piece of aging infrastructure had traveled more than 65 miles. By the time containment crews got a grip on what was happening, the state of Nebraska was dealing with the largest wildfire in its recorded history. Not the largest this year, the largest ever. And that electrical pole, that single, snapped, unremarkable piece of power grid infrastructure, is still the official suspected cause. That is where the story starts, but it is not where it ends. Over the last 12 days, 4 simultaneous wildfires have burned through western and central Nebraska. The combined total is more than 820,000 acres of scorched land, ranch land, grassland, wildlife habitat, generational cattle operations that have existed for a century or more. One woman is dead. Hundreds of ranching families are assessing damage that, in many cases, is catastrophic. And as of today, March 24th, Nebraska is still waiting for the White House to approve a federal disaster declaration. The check has not arrived. The declaration has not been signed. The ranchers are still waiting. We will come back to that declaration, and why its absence matters not just for Nebraska, but for the next state that watches a power pole snap in a windstorm and wonders who will pay. The Morrill Fire ignited at approximately 2:53 in the afternoon on March 12, 2026, northeast of Bridgeport in Morrill County, Nebraska. Governor Jim Pillen said within days that the fire was electrical in nature, sparked by power lines being blown down by extreme wind. An electrical pole snapped. The lines hit dry grass. The National Weather Service had already issued a Day 1 fire weather outlook for that day, marking an extremely critical risk across portions of western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. The fuel was there, the ignition source was there, the wind was there, and whatever failsafe was supposed to prevent that line from becoming a torch, it failed. The fire spread at a pace that overwhelmed local response immediately. It traveled more than 65 miles in roughly 6 hours after ignition. 32 departments responded in Keith County alone. 6 additional departments assisted near Morrill. Even with that mobilization, the fire outpaced them. The National Interagency Fire Center assumed management. The Rocky Mountain Complex Incident Management Team was dispatched. The Nebraska National Guard was activated. Black Hawk helicopters from Nebraska and Iowa were deployed to drop water on hotspots near Lake McConaughey. And still, the fire grew. By March 16th, 4 days after ignition, the Morrill Fire had burned more than 460,000 acres and was still uncontained. The Cottonwood Fire, burning south of Interstate 80 near Brady and Gothenburg, had added another 100,000 acres. The Road 203 Fire in Thomas and Blaine counties added 35,000 more. The Anderson Bridge Fire, west of Valentine and Cherry County, added 17,400 more. In total, 4 fires burning simultaneously in the middle of March, in a state where extreme wildfire behavior in this month is historically rare. The combined burn scar exceeded 820,000 acres. And that is where the obvious read starts to fall apart. Most people see this story as a weather event. Extreme winds, dry conditions, fire season starting early. That is the surface red. The cleaner red is this. A piece of aging electrical infrastructure failed under conditions that the National Weather Service had already declared extremely critical, and that infrastructure failure triggered the largest fire in Nebraska's history. The wind did not start this fire. A power pole did. The same kind of power pole. Part of the same aging, underfunded, deteriorating electrical grid that has now started the largest wildfire in California's history, the largest wildfire in Texas's history, and the largest wildfire in Nebraska's history, all within less than a decade. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is a system failure on a national scale. Here is what the research says about that system. Over 70% of transmission lines in the United States are outdated and approaching 25 years old. The average age of power transformers that supply electricity to over 90% of the country is 40 years old. When power lines fall in extreme wind events roughly 30% of the time, the line does not automatically shut off because the fallen wire draws too little electric current to trigger a circuit breaker. And what happens instead is high impedance arcing, essentially an open electrical arc running along dry vegetation until it finds enough fuel to sustain ignition. That is not a freak accident. That is a documented, known, analyzed failure mode in American electrical infrastructure. In November 2018, a single faulty hook on a Pacific gas and electric transmission line in Butte County, California, broke loose during a windstorm. The resulting fire, the Camp Fire, killed 85 people, destroyed the entire town of Paradise, burned 153,336 acres, and cost an estimated $16.5 billion in damages. PG&E later pled guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. In February 2024, a decayed utility pole in the Texas Panhandle fell on dry grass and sparked the Smokehouse Creek Fire, the largest wildfire in Texas state history at the time. In August 2023, in Lahaina, Hawaii, downed power lines started a fire that killed 102 people in one of the deadliest wildfires in American history. Now Nebraska. Each time the formula is the same. Aging infrastructure, high winds, dry vegetation. A line hits the ground. The failsafe does not trigger. And within hours, the fire is larger than anything that state has ever recorded. The person who died in Nebraska's fire was Rose White. She was 86 years old. She had lived in Arthur County her whole life. When the Morrill Fire came at her, she tried to escape. She did not make it. Governor Jim Pillen confirmed her death at a press conference in Ogallala on March 14th, standing at the Keith County Fairgrounds with smoke still visible on the horizon. He described what he had seen that day as heart-wrenching. He was right. Rose White is the only confirmed human fatality from these fires, but she is not the only loss that will define what happened here. 200 sheep have been confirmed killed by the Morrill Fire, and that number is expected to rise. Officials with the Rocky Mountain Incident Response Team said the actual animal toll will not be known until crews finish working through the burn scar, a perimeter that stretches 399 miles on the Morrill Fire alone. The Cottonwood Fire's perimeter spans 259 miles. The scale of these fires is not something that reveals its damage quickly. Some of it is still being found. Now here is the part that is not making most headlines. These 820,000 acres are not just open grassland. They are the Nebraska Sandhills, one of the most important cattle grazing regions in the entire United States. The Sandhills cover roughly 19,000 square miles of north-central Nebraska and represent some of the finest native grass pasture in North America. The ranching operations built on this land are not industrial feedlots. They are multi-generational family operations, some of which have been running the same land for 100 years or more. And when a fire burns through Sandhills grass at this scale, the recovery timeline is not weeks, it is years. Some ranchers affected by the Morrill Fire have reported losing 95% of their available grazing acreage. Not some of it, not half of it, 95%. What does that mean in practical terms? It means cattle that cannot be fed and cannot be pastured have to be sold immediately at whatever price the market offers, or transported to other states at enormous expense. It means the grass that will take 2 to 3 years to fully recover is gone, and the cattle operation that depended on it cannot simply pause and wait. USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins made the stakes explicit when she toured the damage on March 23rd. If we're not able to do something immediately for these cattlemen, she said, they will have to find new land in a different part of the state, or perhaps in a different state, in order to keep their herds growing and moving. That sentence carries an enormous amount of weight. It is the Agriculture Secretary of the United States telling American ranchers that without immediate federal intervention, some of them may lose their operations entirely. And the federal disaster declaration those ranchers need is still sitting unanswered in Washington. This is not a minor procedural delay. A federal disaster declaration from the White House would unlock FEMA disaster assistance and significantly accelerate the flow of federal recovery funds to affected communities. Nebraska state leaders, including Governor Pillen, Senators Deb Fischer and Pete Ricketts, and Representative Adrian Smith, have all lobbied directly for that declaration. USDA Secretary Rollins has pledged to raise it at a cabinet meeting with the president. As of today, the White House has not responded. Meanwhile, on Monday morning, a convoy of more than 15 semi-trucks loaded with hay bales left Oakland, Nebraska, heading toward the burn zones in the western part of the state. The convoy was organized by a private citizen who saw what was happening and started making calls. Over 500 bales of hay were collected from ranchers across eastern Nebraska and donated to ranchers who had lost their feed supply. It is a profound act of generosity. It is also an indictment of the pace of the official response. There's a family in Garden County who has been ranching the same land since the 1920s. The Van Newkirk Ranch lost a third of its operation to the Morrill Fire in a single afternoon, a third of a century-old ranch gone in hours. That is what an extremely critical fire weather day and an aging power pole produced together. It is the kind of loss that cannot be fully captured in acreage numbers or economic damage estimates. Now here is the forward picture, and it is not finished. The Morrill and Cottonwood fires are approaching full containment as of today, sitting at 98% on both. That is good news. But containment does not mean recovery. The 399-mile perimeter of the Morrill Fire still requires crews to physically patrol every mile, extinguishing smoldering vegetation and windbreaks, root systems, and tree draws that hold heat for days. Dense stands of eastern red kedar, a species that has spread aggressively across Nebraska in recent decades and burns intensely, are scattered throughout the burn scar and are still producing smoke. The job is not finished. It is entering its most painstaking phase. If fire weather conditions remain stable through the end of March, the current containment lines are expected to hold. The fires will be fully extinguished within days. Recovery efforts will begin. USDA programs, the Livestock Indemnity Program, The Emergency Livestock Assistance Program will begin processing claims. That is the optimistic scenario. But the National Weather Service has already noted that conditions in this area of Nebraska are not expected to provide meaningful moisture through the end of the month. Soil moisture is critically low. Green up, the spring return of living grass, is likely to be delayed because the drought conditions that enabled this fire have not been resolved. That means the fire threat in Nebraska does not disappear when the Morrill and Cottonwood fires are declared fully out. It means the window for another fire ignition from any source, including another power line failure, remains open. That is the scenario 2. Another electrical failure, another windstorm, another ignition in a region where the grass is dry, the soil is depleted, and where the emergency crews have just spent 12 days fighting fires on 2 fronts and are exhausted. Nebraska has issued a statewide burn ban through March 27th. After March 27, that ban expires. After March 27, the danger does not. The third scenario is the one that should drive this conversation for years to come, and it is the one that is receiving the least attention right now. What happened in Nebraska in March 2026 is not an anomaly. It is a data point in an accelerating pattern. An aging electrical pole sparked the biggest fire in California's history. An aging electrical pole sparked the biggest fire in Texas's history. Now, an aging electrical pole has sparked the biggest fire in Nebraska's history. These are 3 different states, 3 different utility companies, 3 different regulatory regimes, and the same root cause. The average American power transformer is 40 years old. The average transmission line is approaching its designed service life. The inspections that are supposed to catch failing poles before they snap have been documented as underfunded and inconsistently performed across utility companies nationwide. And when a pole does snap in a windstorm, the condition where it is most likely to snap, roughly 1 in 3 times the automatic shutoff does not trigger. The line stays live. The arc starts. The fire begins. No federal legislation has addressed this systematically. No utility in Nebraska has publicly disclosed what inspection records existed for the pole that started the Morrill Fire. No timeline has been released for when that infrastructure was last assessed. The formal investigation is ongoing, but the pattern is already visible for anyone who chooses to read it. The fire that killed Rose White and burned 820,000 acres of one of America's most important cattle regions did not start because of climate change alone, though climate change made the conditions far worse. It did not start because of insufficient firefighter response, though the fire moved faster than any response could match. It started because a power pole snapped. And power poles across this country are snapping with increasing frequency because the infrastructure holding them up is old, underfunded, and in many cases already marked as deficient. The ranchers in Morrill County, Garden County, Arthur County, Keith County, and Grant County are not waiting for a climate policy debate. They're waiting for a disaster declaration. They are waiting to find out if the federal government is going to help them save what remains of their operations, or if they are going to have to sell their cattle at distressed prices and find grazing land in another state. Some of them have already started making those calls. Everything in this video comes from public sources, official agency reports, credible newswire services, Nebraska Public Media, the USDA, FEMA declarations, the National Interagency Fire Center, and Watch Duty fire tracking data. If you are in an area currently affected by the Nebraska wildfires, follow the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency and your local emergency services for all official guidance. This channel exists to document what is actually happening. What you do with that information is your choice. The Morrill Fire ranks among the 30 largest wildfires ever recorded in American history. It is not in California. It is not in the Pacific Northwest. It is in Nebraska, a state that barely registers in the national conversation about wildfire risk. And that is precisely why it matters so much right now. Every year, the conversation about wildfire in America centers on the West Coast, the forests, the canyons, the Santa Ana winds. And while those fires are real and devastating, there is a pattern expanding beyond those zones that is not getting the attention it demands. The Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Plains, Nebraska. The Great Plains are burning in ways they historically have not burned. And the fuel behind that expansion is not just drought. It is the combination of drought, aging electrical infrastructure, and decades of eastern red cedar and invasive grass species colonizing native rangeland and turning it into continuous fire fuel. The conditions that allowed the Morrill Fire to travel 65 miles in 6 hours do not go away when this fire is out. They are structural. They are getting worse. And the infrastructure, responsible for multiple ignitions across multiple states, is still in the ground, still in service, still aging. Here is the question this fire puts in front of every American who drives by a power pole, which is to say, every American. When the third largest fire in U.S. history starts from a snapped power line, after the same thing happened in California, in Texas, in Hawaii, At what point does the utility industry face the same accountability that any other industry would face when its infrastructure repeatedly kills people? That is the question nobody in the national media is centering on this story. It should be. If you are someone who follows these events, not because they are dramatic, but because you believe people deserve to know what is actually happening before the next fire starts, this channel is for you. Subscribe, because the next story we are tracking involves a dam system in the American Midwest that engineers have classified as high risk, where the scheduled repair deadline passed 3 years ago, and nobody moved. Rose White was 86 years old. She had lived her whole life in Arthur County, Nebraska. She tried to get out. A power pole put that choice in front of her. That choice should never have existed,